1 Samuel chapter 13. And shouldn't have too much of a problem getting through this chapter tonight. But this describes Saul's second major military conquest. Although this is the beginning of Saul's downfall, he doesn't last very long as a king before he starts goofing up. And he blames it primarily on Samuel. All right, but let's look at this. Verse 1, Saul, and by the way, the original Hebrew, the Hebrew text that has survived has been corrupted at this point, and by that what I mean is it's missing a couple of words. So you'll notice, like for example in my Bible, it says Saul was 40 years old, and the 40 is in italics. When he began to reign, and he reigned, and this part, 30 is in italics, 2 years over Israel. Now we know Saul reigned a whole lot longer than 2 years over Israel. So you may wonder, well, if the Hebrew text is corrupted, where do we get the 40 years old and the reign 32 years? Well, there are other texts, for example, that I know I've explained it to you before, but the question is, who in here remembers what the Septuagint is?
It is the document that was made by 70 men at a conference that determined what was canonical in the Bible. Yes? No?
No. That's the Council of Nicaea.
Crap.
By the way, that's Nicaea.
Oops. We're both idiots. It's okay. Septuagint.
Hebrew translation into
Greek.
And was that
Alexandria, Egypt. And there were, you're almost right on it, there were approximately 70 scholars in it. It's believed there might have been either 72 or 74, but they just kind of rounded it off and called it the 70. So you'll actually see the Septuagint abbreviated with the Roman numerals for 70, LXX. Some people pronounce it Septuagint, others Septuagint. Which one's correct? They all are. Just depends on your perspective.
My Bible says Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 42 years. So
Reversed.
We got to reverse.
Yeah.
What version
say
is
that
that?
at all.
What version do you have?
What's that?
My Bible doesn't say that at all.
Mine doesn't say
Well,
how old he was either.
What is your Bible?
The
say?
point being, the original Hebrew
New Living Translation
has gotten messed up at that point. We don't know exactly how old, but in all likelihood, based on that Greek translation, which was translated, probably about 300 or 400 years BC in Egypt during the what's called the dispersion, or the diaspora is the correct theological term, where a lot of the Jews had left Israel completely. They didn't even speak Hebrew or Aramaic anymore, but they could read and write Greek. And so that's what prompted them to make that Greek translation. And so there's a lot of places in the Bible where there are questions as to the translation of something, or like in this case where the Hebrew is completely unreadable, that they've referred to that translation to see what it says, but that's where they got that figure from. Now, how they got that reversed and put 30 years old and 42 years, I have no idea.
I have a New American Standard 95 edition up, and it says 30 and 42, but it's got the 30 and the 40 in italics.
Well, I can pretty well guarantee you that Saul was not 30 years old, and he did not reign 42 years, and here's why. And this we do know from the Hebrew, because later in this chapter, it says that his son Jonathan was one of his major commanders. If Saul was only 30 years old and he had an adult son, old enough to command a third of the army, then Saul got a real early start.
Well, even if he was 40, that's still a big jump.
Well, yes, but it's a little bit more feasible for Saul to have been 40
Yeah.
with an adult son named Jonathan, who was commander of a third of his army.
Isn't 30 also the age, coming of age transition for Jewish men?
No.
13.
I thought they weren't considered fully adults until 30.
That's for preaching, or for being a
Okay.
teacher.
That's when they assumed leadership positions, but they were considered adults at age 13.
That's why they have the bar mitzvah, huh?
Mhm.
Yep.
And actually, if we want to be, make a little short hop down this sociological rabbit hole here, it's only been within the last 150 years that cultures, including ours, have bought into the idea of adolescence. If you look at any ancient, historical text, schools and what have you, the idea of adolescence did not exist 200 years ago. You were either a child or you were an adult. There was no in between. Adolescence is something that has crept into our society as a result of just sociological experts who've decided, well, we can't have these 13 and 14-year-olds working in factories and doing adult jobs because they're just not old enough. Well, bottom line was, for the previous, 5,000 and some odd years of Earth's history, teenagers were treated as adults and were held to adult standards. And maybe that's part of the problem with our culture, is we're not holding our teenagers to.
We're not even holding our adults to adult standards anymore.
Well, that's true too. All right, but to get back to our passage of scripture, if you see in your Bible that the ages there are in italics, that's why. The bottom line is, whether he's 30, 40, or 50, or who, it isn't going to change the theological meaning of this one iota. But there you go. So if anybody hops up and says, wait a minute, that's not what my Bible says, now you know why. Because the original Hebrew has been corrupted at that point. Verse 2. Now, Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel, of which 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, while 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah of Benjamin. Now, again, this is the reason why I insist that there is no way Saul was only 30 years old. Because at best, Jonathan would have been a teenager at this point. But yet Jonathan is old enough to be commanding, an army of 1,000 men. Saul wasn't 30 years old. But anyway. But he sent away the rest of the people, each to his tent. So Saul had a pretty good standing army at this point. But he decides he's going to fight this battle against the Philistines with 3,000. Verse 3 says, and Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it, you think. Then Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. Interesting at this point how he refers to themselves. They're not Israelites or men of Israel or Jews. He refers to his own people as let the Hebrews hear, which again kind of lends credibility to some of the other ancient texts from other languages that equated Hebrews with what some of the other languages refer to as the Habaru, which I knew you'd ask that question. So.
In the book I'm reading, it was the Hubari, what they referred to as.
Hubari, Habaru, same word.
Yeah, exactly. Same root word.
Mm-hmm. And all Israel heard the news that Saul had smitten the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become odious to the Philistines. I really like the way how there's so many places in the Bible where if you're disliked by someone, you're odious. I don't know about you folks, but I know a few odious people in this world. The people were then summoned to Saul at Gilgal. Now the Philistines assembled to fight with Israel. Now notice the difference here. We've got an army of 3,000 Israelites. Now before we continue on, remember this. At this point in their history, the Israelites were still fighting with spears, stones, clubs, arrows with stone heads, because they had no metallurgical science. All of their blacksmiths had either been kidnapped by the Philistines or assassinated by them. The Israelites didn't have any swords. None. Except for apparently Jonathan and Saul had a couple that they'd come up with from somewhere.
Taken from the Philistines.
Probably taken from Philistines. So now the Philistines assembled to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and people like the sand which is on the seashore in abundance. And they came up and camped in Michmash, east of Bethaven. Now, you got an army of 30,000 chariots, and of course back then, a chariot was an ancient army's version of armor, or a tank. 6,000 horsemen, that's cavalry.
And I would guess about 60,000 footmen.
Probably so.
Good 100,000 army here.
Going up against an army of 3,000. Now, on human terms, the Israelites are about to get squashed. There's no way they're going to win this. At least, again, on their own. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, you think so, for they were hard pressed. By the way, I looked that word up, that's strait in the Hebrew, and it basically means exactly that they were in a tight spot. So then the people hid themselves in caves and thickets and cliffs and cellars and in pits. They were running for the hills. Also, some of the Hebrews crossed the Jordan into the land of Gad and Gilead. Now, let me remind you, Gad and Gilead, that's where the earlier tribes that had refused to cross the Jordan River had settled on the east side of the Jordan River. Now, by the way, today, everything east of the Jordan River is the country of Jordan. But as God had originally intended, the Promised Land included both sides of the Jordan River. So the time will come in the not too distant future when the land of Jordan will no longer exist. It will belong to Israel also. So a lot of these folks, as they're running from this, they're crossing the river to go back over to where the other tribes are. It says, but as for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. Now he waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel. Samuel apparently had told Saul to wait here for 7 days, and then Samuel was going to come and offer a sacrifice. Now, why the Philistines did not attack during that 7-day period, we can only guess at. And my guess would be that somehow they were divinely, prohibited from attacking. Because knowing the size of their army and going against, what is now not even 3,000 Israelites, because most of them apparently took off running, the Philistines would have just moved in and wiped out what few were there. So the only reason that I can think of that they didn't attack is somehow God prevented them from it.
Or maybe they just decided we're in no big hurry because we know we got this. Let them run, let them scatter, we'll clean up the mess in our own good time.
Maybe. But you get a lot more military satisfaction from killing them off. And the Philistines were known for that. All right, said, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So what you got here, this is the excuse Saul gives. You told me to wait here 7 days, And while we sat here for a week, the few that I had left were leaving. So Saul said, bring to me the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came about as soon as he finished offering the burnt offering, that behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and greet him. Now, let me tell you what's going on here. There were customarily 2 sacrifices a day. One around mid-morning and one around mid-afternoon. Now, Samuel just told him to wait 7 days and I'm going to come offer a sacrifice. Samuel could easily have shown up by the afternoon sacrifice and still have kept his promise. Saul is getting impatient because on the 7th day, at the morning sacrifice, Samuel is nowhere to be seen. And so by the time of the afternoon sacrifice, I'm sure by that point, Saul probably had the altar ready, the animals ready, and figured, where is Samuel? Apparently, Samuel showed up just in time for what would have been the afternoon sacrifice. But Saul, in his haste, because he sees all his soldiers deserting, and for all we know, that may have been God's intention to begin with, to narrow it down to an absolute rock bottom minimum. We've seen God do that before. But Samuel shows up, Saul goes out to meet him, and at this point, the sacrifice has already been made, and Saul did it. And Saul, which tribe was he from?
Benjamin.
Benjamin. Saul had no authority whatsoever to be offering this sacrifice. Even as the king, there's nothing in the law of Moses that gave the king the authority to offer a sacrifice. Even King David, when he from time to time served as an ad hoc priest, but even then as from the tribe of Judah, when David would wear, we're told that from time to time he would wear a linen ephod, which is a priestly garment. Most theologians are in agreement that David did that on certain special occasions because he was functioning in the role of not an Aaronic priest, but a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Different priesthood, which would make sense when you figured that David was the ancestor of Jesus, and Jesus himself did not practice his priesthood after the order of Aaron. But we're told, in fact, that's 2/3 of the book of Hebrews talks about how Jesus was and is forever a priest according to Melchizedek. Saul, on the other hand, has no such authority.
Was Samuel the only one who could offer sacrifices? Wouldn't Saul have had other Levites with him with his army? It seems odd that there were no other Levite priests there.
But Levites are not allowed to make a sacrifice. A Levite can prepare the sacrifice, they can prepare the altar, they can put together and take apart the tabernacle and what. They are the attendants. But it required somebody who was a descendant of Aaron to actually offer the sacrifice. Now, in Samuel's case, again, we know Samuel was not from the tribe of Levi, but he was adopted by Eli, who was a descendant of Aaron, which makes Samuel a direct descendant of Aaron by adoption, which is why Samuel was authorized to do this. Saul was not. So we'll see what happens here. In verse 11, Samuel's not real happy. Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "Because I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed days, and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash. Therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not asked the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering." Interesting how he describes that. I had no choice. I forced myself. But the fact is that with 2 sacrifices a day, Samuel promised he'd be there in 7 days. He didn't tell Saul whether it be the morning or the afternoon sacrifice.
Do you think maybe Samuel showed up slightly late as a test for
I'm sure Samuel probably showed up exactly the time God told him to.
Yeah.
But Saul here he's admitted that, who's he more afraid of?
If the people.
He's afraid of the Philistines, and he's afraid of his own people. Well, they were deserting me.
Yes.
Well, so what? The point is that Saul didn't trust God.
Yeah.
God could have done anything. In fact, you would think at this point, what happened in the previous encounter with the Philistines, that Saul would have known that if they do what God tells them to do, God will take care of the problem. But we see Saul, spiritually speaking, has learned nothing at this point. In fact, he seems to be going downhill already. Verse 13, it says, and Samuel said to Saul, you have acted foolishly. You've not kept the commandment of the Lord your God. Now notice here how Samuel describes it. Samuel is reminding Saul, he's not just my God, he's your God. The Lord your God that you are responsible for. Which commandment did he disobey? The commandment regarding the sacrifice. It said, which he commanded you, for now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself. Notice, and by the way, let me stop here. In the original Hebrew, now there are nuances of this, like there's subjunctive, which basically in English the subjunctive is sort of like, instead of saying I did or I could do or whatever, we might say, well, I would have done, or, I should, I should do such a, those are all what we call the subjunctive. They're not actual factual statements of what happened, but the things that should happen, would happen, that's all subjunctive. Hebrew has an equivalent for that. But as far as the tense, I was, I am, I will be, Hebrew only has 2 tenses. A present tense and a perfect tense. That's it. As far as grammar and linguistics go, Hebrew is actually a very primitive language. There is no future tense in Hebrew. You don't have, all of these, like in English we can say, I will have done, which is a future perfect. Which is almost kind of something that's past tense or that's occurred, but still in the future. Doesn't make any sense, but we can say that in English. I had versus I have. Past perfect. Hebrew doesn't have any of those nuances of tenses. It's either past completed action or it's present tense. That's it. So the reason that's important here, notice in verse 14, it says the Lord, and this is in perfect tense, has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Notice Samuel basically tells Saul, it's already a done deal. God has already, past tense, in perfect tense, appointed somebody else as king. You're done. Not God will appoint, it's God, excuse me, God's already done it. Now, by the way, back to verse 13. Now, we know that according to Jacob said several generations prior to this that the scepter would never depart from the tribe of Judah. But notice here that Samuel even tells Saul, if you'd been obedient, he would have established your kingdom, a Benjamite, over God, over the land forever. So how is it that Jacob can prophesy that the scepter would be with Judah, and yet Samuel tells Saul, God would have given you a permanent kingdom?
Because the opportunity hadn't come yet to give it to Judah.
Because God already knew what was going to happen.
Later on.
There you go. That's the issue. God allowed Jacob to prophesy that the royal tribe would be Judah several generations before Saul ever lived, because God already knew Saul was going to fail. So this isn't one of those things where God set Saul up. God just knew Saul was going to fall flat on his face anyway.
He knew Benjamin was going to fall flat in his face.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So there is not a conflict or anything that's contradictory here that, Saul can't say, well, you prophesied that I wouldn't have the kingdom anyway. No, that's just God saying that he already knew what was going to happen.
This is his second military campaign, so this has got to be very early in his reign.
Oh, yeah.
Yet he continued to reign for 32 years.
Look how long he chased
But
David around for.
God already pulled the rug out from under his reign right from the beginning. Because he screwed up right at the beginning.
Yep. Now, as we know, as we continue studying this and continuing on in our study here, and I'm sure you've read this before, probably the only reason Saul's throne didn't collapse before this was simply because King David refused to usurp the throne until it was clear that Saul was gone. David had every right to assassinate Saul, on several occasions.
Yeah.
I mean, let's face it, Saul spent the rest of his life trying to kill David.
Yeah.
David had every right in self-defense, if nothing else, to kill Saul. But David refused to do it until Saul died from some other means. And that's the only reason Saul kept his throne as long as he did, because David refused to raise his hand against him.
Because Saul was God's anointed.
There we go.
And David refused to take action against God's anointed.
Man,
All right.
his own heart.
What's that?
Man after his own heart.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we can finish this up here in just a few more minutes here, so it won't take. Verse 15. Then Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin, and Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. Notice we've gone from 3,000 down to 600. Now Saul and his son Jonathan and the people who were present with him were staying in Gibeah of Benjamin, while the Philistines camped at Michmash. By the way, that's only just about 3 miles apart.
Sorry.
And the raiders came from the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned toward Ophrah to the land of Shual, and another company toward Beth-horon, and another company turned toward the border which overlooks the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. In other words, the Philistines sent their men in 3 directions with the intention of encircling the Israelites. Philistines knew there was only a few of them left, and they were going to surround them and wipe them out. Now, in verse 19 is why we know at this point that the Israelites are still fighting in the Stone Age. They have no metallurgy at all. Now, no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines, each to sharpen his plowshare, his mattocks, his axe, and his hoe. And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares, the mattocks, the forks, and the axes, and to fix the hoes. And by the way, 2/3 of a shekel of silver. The Philistines were absolutely cleaning them out economically. And this should never have happened if the Jews had done what they were told to do from the beginning, which was to wipe out any of these Canaanite tribes. They failed to do it, and they paid for it with the Philistines. Verse 22. So it came about on the day of battle that neither sword nor spear was found in the hands of any of the people, who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with Saul and his son Jonathan. In other words, Saul and Jonathan's the only two in the whole army that's got a metal sword. The rest of them are fighting with arrows with stone arrowheads on them and spears. And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. And that's where we'll stop. And we'll pick up with chapter 14 on Wednesday. So what you see here is at this point, the Philistines have them outnumbered. They're outgunned. By any stretch of the imagination, the Israelites had absolutely no chance whatsoever of winning this encounter. I think that's one of the reasons God allowed this to happen, so that when he did deliver them, they would be idiots to think that anything other than God's divine deliverance accomplished this. All right, questions this evening? All right.